Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we'll drift through the dimly lit halls of medieval castles and the Biava, smoky cottages of peasants, where fatherhood was sometimes less of a blessing and more of a minor daily catastrophe. You'll find yourself standing in a drafty chamber that smells faintly of boiled turnips and old ambitions. A father is somewhere nearby, probably snoring on a three-legged stool, clutching a cup of weak ale like it's the last achievement he'll ever claim. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and you might imagine this is a place of sturdy paternal guidance. But no. You're about to discover how frequently medieval dads turned out to be a little less inspiring than the poems promised. The castles had tapestries of grand exploits, sure, but behind them, you'd often find unpaid debts, unwashed linens, and children quietly deciding they'd rather grow up to be anything else. And the cottages. They were places where the only legacy a father left behind was a strap hung by the door, or a garden plot that never quite fed everyone. You might think that even in an age of leeches and lords, some universal bond held families together. Sometimes it did. Often, it was about as sturdy as a damp straw mattress. From kings who ruled their households like petty fiefdoms of neglect, to common labourers whose tempers cracked as easily as their clay cups, we'll trace the unremarkable miseries of children who discovered early that coming home could be the worst part of the day. You might not survive this one not because of swordplay or plague, but because disappointment has a way of wearing you down more efficiently than any siege. So, before you settle in, feel free to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. You wake up before dawn because your father believes that sleeping past the first bell is a sign you'll grow up lazy, or worse, imaginative. The air in the cottage is so cold it feels like the walls are breathing out frost, and your straw mattress has moulded itself into a lumpy sculpture of your shape, an accidental monument to discomfort. You'd think your father would offer some warmth, or even a word of encouragement before the day begins, but instead, he grunts in your direction like a tired ox and lurches to his feet. Maybe you expect a hug or a clap on the shoulder, something to mark the occasion of being alive another morning. What you get is a lecture about your posture, your chores, and the questionable character of your mother's side of the family. The words tumble out of his mouth as dry and brittle as last year's rushes. You watch him stretch, groaning in the gloom, and you can't help noticing he smells like a turnip that decided to ferment out of spite. He steps to the hearth, prods the embers, and mutters about how you failed to keep the fire alive properly. You know the routine. If the coals are too cold, it's your fault. If they're too hot, it's your fault. If they're perfect, he'll say nothing and move on, as though the miracle was inevitable and certainly not thanks to you. He picks up the same battered cup he's been drinking from, for as long as you can remember, the rim chipped like a broken tooth. Maybe today he'll pour water. No, it's ale again, weak and sour, but enough to take the edge off his chronic dissatisfaction. You watch him gulp it down and rub the back of his neck, as though that simple movement costs him more than you can imagine. He tells you that when he was your age, he had already learned to plough a straight furrow, barter for firewood, and survive a winter that was colder than any cold you'll ever know. You have heard this so many times that the words are carved into your mind like graffiti you can't scrape off. The truth is, you suspect his memories are half invention, but you nod anyway, because you've also learned that questioning him is like poking a bear that hasn't eaten in a month. He orders you to fetch the pail of water from the well, his voice heavy with that familiar tone, equal parts command and disappointment. You step outside into the raw morning. The sky is a damp sheet of pewter. The grass crunches under your boots. You breathe in the smell of wet earth and wood smoke, and something else, something sour that you realize is the lingering fog of your father's unwashed cloak. When you return, expecting perhaps a small word of thanks, he only frowns at the way you carry the bucket. The water slushes a little. He shakes his head, muttering about how you'll never be strong if you can't hold a pail steady. You want to tell him your arms ache from carrying everything he hands you, from the weight of his expectations to the heavy silence he never bothers to lift. But you just set the bucket down, quietly, and wonder if tomorrow will feel any different. You spend the first hour of daylight doing the same small chores you did yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that, hauling firewood from the damp pile beside the stable, scraping the remnants of last night's porridge out of the pot, trying to make it look as if the family eats better than they do. Your father sits at the table, inspecting the dull blade of his old knife as though he suspects it of betrayal. He doesn't say much, but he doesn't have to. You can feel his disappointment breathing down your neck, like a dog waiting for scraps. Maybe you imagine that if you work quickly enough, he'll be satisfied. Perhaps he'll even nod, or offer a grunt that sounds almost approving. But no. As soon as you set the pot down, he tells you the edge of your cleaning cloth is frayed, your shirt is crooked, your hair is evidence of sloth. It seems everything about you is an inconvenience to him, an unfinished project he never wanted to start. The cold seeps into your bones, the kind of chill that feels less like weather and more like an unspoken judgment from the universe. You remember the stories the village priest told about fathers being guides, protectors, pillars of the household. You almost laugh. Yours is more like a creaking signpost that points nowhere useful and resents you for asking directions. He finally gets to his feet, joints cracking like old hinges. He tells you to follow him outside because the thatch on the shed roof has slipped again. You trail behind, watching the back of his thick neck and the way his shoulders stoop as if he's forever carrying a sack of disappointments he collected in his youth and never set down. You want to feel pity, but mostly you feel tired. At the shed, he gestures vaguely at the roof and expects you to know exactly what to do. You climb up the rickety ladder, your fingers numb against the wood, and try not to think about the way it wobbles like a drunk uncle at a festival. He stands below, offering no advice beyond an occasional sigh that seems to say you're not moving fast enough, not careful enough, not enough. The thatch is damp and smells like mushrooms that have given up on life. You lift a bundle and jam it back into place, hoping it won't slip again. For a moment you think perhaps you've done well until you hear him mutter that you've left a gap. The gap, in his mind, is proof of every failing you've ever committed, from your first unsteady steps to this morning's half-burned firewood. You close your eyes, count to 5, and imagine you're somewhere else. When you climb down, you expect at least a flicker of acknowledgement. Instead, he turns away and starts picking at the strap on his belt, the one he sometimes uses to make a point when words seem insufficient. You feel your stomach hollow out the way it always does when you see that motion, but he doesn't raise his voice or the strap today. He simply says you'll have to try again tomorrow. You stand there in the half-light, the roof patched, your hands raw, your spirit frayed, and you can't help wondering if this is all fatherhood is, a long, slow draining of hope from every corner of a child's mind. By midday, the sun struggles weakly through the low clouds, illuminating your father's face in a way that makes him look older, worn down to the gristle by years of worry, bad harvests, and the relentless disappointment of every child he ever produced. You might think this moment would soften him, that perhaps he'd look at you and remember he once felt something other than resignation. But the only feeling that crosses his face is a kind of exhausted appraisal, as though he's counting up your shortcomings like debts he'll never be able to pay off. He gestures to the vegetable patch behind the cottage, the rows of stunted cabbages and leprous-looking turnips leaning against each other like conspirators. You're supposed to pull the weeds before evening, because if you don't, he'll insist the plants will wither under the influence of your laziness. You kneel down in the cold dirt, the soil damp enough to soak into your trousers within seconds. The chill slides up your legs, pooling in your stomach. You tell yourself you don't mind, that this is just how it is. But part of you wonders if you're the only child in the village who feels like a guest in their own family. Your father shuffles behind you, stopping now and then to inspect your work. He does it without speaking, which is somehow worse than the scolding. The silence stretches between you like an old rope, fraying and ready to snap. You pluck a weed, toss it aside, and watch the little clump of roots land in the mud. It feels almost symbolic. Maybe everything here is a metaphor you're too tired to unravel. After what feels like an hour, he clears his throat, the sound startling in the hush. For a moment, you think he might offer a story, one of those long-winded tales about how, in his youth, he worked harder, slept less, and never once complained. But all he says is that you're moving too slowly, that you'll never amount to much if you can't even clear a few weeds before dusk. You want to remind him that it rained all week, that the ground is half frozen, that your fingers are stiff as dry twigs, but you swallow the words because you've learned that any explanation sounds like an excuse in his ears. He wanders off to the fence where the old pig pen leans sideways in a pose of permanent defeat. You watch him from the corner of your eye, noting how he rubs his temples with the same hand he uses to measure out punishment. It occurs to you that he's probably tired of himself as well, but he'd never admit that. Admitting weakness is a luxury reserved for men who have something to fall back on, and he has nothing but this cottage, these failing vegetables, and you. When you finish the row, you stand, wiping your hands on your tunic. The damp earth has left streaks across the fabric, a visible proof of your effort, but also an invitation for more critique. You look over, hoping stupidly that he'll say something kind, or at least neutral. He only nods at the next patch and turns away again, as if he's already bored of your existence. You feel the cold seep deeper, and you wonder whether it's the weather or just the shape of your life. Later in the afternoon, you're sent to the storage shed to fetch the kindling, because apparently you can't be trusted to rest even for a moment without becoming more useless. The shed is little more than a sagging collection of rotting planks, the walls stitched together by decades of damp and disappointment. You'd think there might be something comforting about the smell of old wood and hay, but it only reminds you of all the other hours you've spent here, sifting through splinters and mice droppings, hoping your father wouldn't come around the corner with that expression he wears when he's decided you've failed again. You gather an armful of sticks, trying to ignore the way the brittle ends poke through your shirt and scrape your ribs. Perhaps you imagine that if you move fast enough, if you're careful enough, you'll deliver the bundle without incident. But as you step out into the yard, the heel of your boot catches on a hidden rock, a sharp lump of irony masquerading as solid ground. The world tilts, the kindling scatters across the frost-hardened dirt, and for one suspended second, you think maybe you'll just keep falling forever. When you regain your balance, your father is already there, standing over the mess with the look of someone who's been expecting this exact failure since you first learned to walk. You wait for him to help you gather the sticks, but of course he doesn't. Instead, he folds his arms and sighs, the sound somehow heavier than any words. You start picking up the pieces, each movement punctuated by the quiet certainty that you've confirmed his worst suspicions about you. He doesn't shout. You almost wish he would. Shouting would at least feel alive, an eruption of heat in this perpetual winter of mild disdain. But no, he just watches, eyes fixed on you as if you were a bad harvest he can neither improve nor forget. Maybe you think that if you stand up straight, if you look him in the eye, he'll recognize you as more than an extension of his disappointments. But when you try, he glances away, studying the horizon like it's more interesting than anything you could ever do or say. The wind picks up, carrying the smell of smoke from the neighbor's hearth and something sour you can't quite name. It stings your eyes, and you blink hard to clear them, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of thinking you're crying. You gather the last few sticks, your fingers numb and clumsy, and hold the bundle tight against your chest, as though it might shield you from the cold. When you finally straighten up, he clears his throat and tells you not to drop them again, his voice flat and practical, as if he's instructing a mule rather than a child. You nod, because there's nothing else to do, and carry the kindling back to the house, each step measured and careful. Inside, the air is no warmer, but at least you can set the wood down and retreat to the corner by the hearth, where no one expects anything from you for a little while. You watch the fire sputter along, smoke curling up into the beams, and you think perhaps this is the closest thing to peace you'll ever get a few minutes in a half-lit room, feeling like something more than a burden. As dusk begins to pool in the corners of the cottage, your father sits down to his supper with the grim determination of a man who expects disappointment even from a bowl of pottage. The stew simmers in its cracked pot, sending up thin, apologetic wisps of steam that smell of onions past their prime and cabbage that gave up weeks ago. You ladle it into his wooden bowl, careful not to spill, because you already know he counts every dribble as proof that you're proofing. Maybe you tell yourself that if you serve him quickly, if you keep your gaze on the table and your voice low, he'll have nothing to correct. But you're wrong, of course. He takes one look at the pottage and informs you that it's too thin, that your mother never learned how to cook properly, and by extension, neither did you. You stand there, the ladle dripping back into the pot, and try to imagine a life where a meal isn't an opportunity to measure your worth and find it lacking. He picks up the coarse bread that sits beside the bowl, the loaf so hard it could deflect arrows. He breaks off a piece with a sigh, chewing slowly as though each bite requires the last reserves of his strength. You think perhaps he'll offer some to you, maybe a crust to gnaw on while the fire burns low, but he doesn't. He sets the bread down with exaggerated care, as if to remind you it belongs to him alone. Outside, the darkness presses against the walls, seeping in through the thin seams in the wattle and daub. The wind hums along the eaves, a sad little tune that seems to echo your own thoughts. You sit on your stool, hands folded in your lap, and try not to look as hungry as you feel. Your father doesn't notice. Or if he does, he pretends not to, because it's easier to ignore a child's hunger than to admit you've nothing more to offer. When he's finished, he pushes the bowl away and rubs his forehead. You expect him to stand, to shuffle over to the hearth and stare into the embers as he does every evening. But tonight he surprises you. He looks at you, really looks, as though for a brief moment he remembers you're his child and not just another obligation. The moment hangs there, fragile as a spider's web. You think perhaps he might say something gentle, something you can tuck away for the nights when everything feels heavier than you can bear. But he doesn't. His gaze slides past you, settling on the wall where a ragged scrap of tapestry clings to a crooked nail. He clears his throat and tells you to fetch more firewood before the cold sets in deeper. The moment breaks, as easily and as finely as a dried twig underfoot. You rise without a word, step outside into the dark, and feel the cold slap your face in greeting. You tell yourself it's better this way, that expecting kindness is just another way to be disappointed. As you gather the splintered logs, you think about the stories of noble fathers in the old tales, the ones who taught their sons courage and their daughters grace, and you wonder what it would feel like to be that sort of child, in that sort of chill. But you already know this isn't that story. When you return with the firewood balanced against your chest, your arms aching from the effort, your father is sitting exactly where you left him, staring into the middle distance like a man waiting for a future that never arrives. You stack the logs by the hearth, careful to keep them tidy, because you've learned that even a crooked pile can be transformed into an accusation. The fire has shrunk to a sullen cluster of embers, glowing like a tired memory. You nudge them with the iron poker, watching the sparks flare and vanish before they can become anything more than a passing thought. Your father doesn't speak. He just shifts on his stool, rubbing the back of his neck in that slow, circular way that always means he's about to remember some old grievance you have no hope of fixing. The silence between you feels thick as the smoke curling along the beams overhead, filling the little room with the scent of damp wood, stale air, and the faint tang of regret. Maybe you think if you sit very still, he'll forget you're there altogether, but even that small hope shrivels when he finally clears his throat and begins recounting, for the 100th time, the story of how he built this cottage with nothing but his hands, a blunt hatchet, and the sheer determination not to die in someone else's barn. He tells it like it's a tale of triumph, a proof that any man who works hard enough can carve a life out of unpromising soil. But you can't help noticing how his voice trails off when he reaches the part about the roof, how he never mentions the neighbour who lent him the beams, or the debts he's still paying off in bitter little installments of pride. You nod along, because it's safer than contradicting him. Every word he speaks feels like a brick he's stacking between you, a wall built out of recollection and disappointment. The light outside fades into a sullen grey, the sort of twilight that makes everything look tired. Your father shifts again, glancing toward the door as though he expects something better to walk through it. When nothing does, he sighs a long, slow exhalation that seems to drain the last scraps of warmth from the air. He rubs his forehead and mutters that you'll never understand what it means to build something with your own hands, that your generation doesn't know struggle the way he did. You want to tell him that you're trying, that every day feels like a test you didn't agree to take, but you keep the words behind your teeth because he doesn't want to hear them. Instead, you stand and feed another log into the fire. The flames catch slowly, licking at the wood with a hunger you almost envy. You watch the light dance across the walls, illuminating the cracks in the plaster and the stains in the rushes on the floor. You think perhaps those cracks are the truest part of the cottage, proof that even walls meant to protect can't hold everything together forever. Your father doesn't notice you watching him. Or if he does, he pretends not to. He rubs his eyes, stands up with a groan, and announces he's going to check the latch on the barn door. You listen to his footsteps fade into the yard and feel the silence settle back over the room, soft as an old blanket and twice as heavy. You sit by the fire after he leaves, your hands spread near the warmth, trying to convince yourself it's enough. The flames flicker and spit as though mocking your hope of comfort, casting restless shadows across the low ceiling beams. The rushes beneath your boots crackle with every shift of your weight, and you remember how your father insists that a child who fidgets is a child who isn't learning. So you force yourself to be still, even though the urge to stand and walk somewhere anywhere is as persistent as a stone in your shoe. The minutes pass in that peculiar slow way they do when you're waiting for something you can't name. Maybe you expect he'll return with some small sign that he sees you, a nod, a question, even a tired complaint that acknowledges you exist. But the door stays closed, and the quiet stretches out long enough that you start to wonder if he's decided not to come back at all. You picture him out there in the gloom, standing by the barn and thinking of all the lives he might have led if he hadn't ended up here, tethered to a child who never seems to measure up. When he finally does reappear, he doesn't look at you. He sets the latch bar across the door with the same care he gives to every small, necessary task, as though these rituals are the only things that keep the world from unraveling. He hangs his cloak on the wooden peg by the hearth, and you see how the fabric is worn thin where his shoulders have pressed against it season after season. It smells faintly of rain and old sweat, and something sour that you suspect is disappointment, soaked so deeply into the weave it will never wash out. He sits again, his hands cupped around the bowl you left for him earlier, though he doesn't eat. For a moment you think he might speak, might finally say whatever it is he's been holding behind that tired frown. But he only stares at the fire, as if the embers have more to offer than you ever could. You study his face in the wavering light, noting the way the lines around his mouth look carved there by the same blunt knife he used to build this place. You wonder if he ever wished for more, or if he simply decided long ago that wanting was a luxury better abandoned. You almost ask him, almost let the question slip between you, but you bite it back, because even curiosity feels dangerous in this house. Instead, you stand and begin sweeping the rushes into a neater pile, though you know he'll still find something lacking when he notices. Perhaps you're tidying out of habit, or maybe because it feels like the only thing you can control in a day built entirely out of obligations you never chose. When you finish, he finally shifts his gaze just enough to register you're still there. His eyes meet yours for a single, unguarded heartbeat, and you think you see something soft there, something close to regret, or even apology. But as quickly as it appears, it's gone, replaced by the familiar flat scrutiny that always leaves you colder than any draft. He nods once, not approval exactly, more an acknowledgement that you've done what was expected. And then he turns back to the fire, as though that flickering light is the only company he trusts. Night falls fully now, pressing against the little windows with a damp insistence, as though the darkness itself wants to crawl inside and have a look at your meagre life. The fire burns lower despite all your efforts, settling into a dull red glow that barely holds back the cold. You wonder if your father will notice when it goes out, or if he'll simply blame you in the morning for letting it die. You suspect you already know which. He finally stands, joints cracking in the hush, and moves to the corner where the straw mattress waits. You can't help but think of it as a nest more than a bed, a tangled heap of old rushes, flattened wool, and the lingering aroma from generations of tired bodies. He lowers himself with a grunt that sounds too big for the small room. For a moment, you think he might say good night, but he only tugs the blanket around his shoulders, closes his eyes, and leaves you alone in the company of the fire's last fragile embers. You sit there a while, listening to the soft rasp of his breathing, a rhythm so familiar it almost feels like part of the building itself. You remember being small enough to believe that sound meant safety, that, as long as he was there, nothing could happen to you. Now you know better. Now you understand that sometimes the danger is not what waits outside but what settles in the spaces between people who share too many silent meals. You pull your own thin blanket tighter around your shoulders, though it doesn't do much against the drafts sneaking under the door. The cold finds every weakness, every careless crack and gap, and it seeps into you in the same slow way your father's disappointment is never urgent, never sudden, just a steady, relentless invasion. You try to remember the last time he said something kind, but the memory is either too faint or never existed in the first place. Perhaps you think that tomorrow will be different, that some small gesture will shift the pattern, but you already know the truth. Tomorrow will dawn grey and thin and tired, just like today. He will wake up with the same complaints folded neatly beside him like yesterday's cloak. You will rise with the same hope that this time you might be enough to fill whatever hollow space he's always carried, but it will never be quite the right shape. Your eyes wander across the dark room, to the warped beams overhead, to the battered wooden chest that holds the few things he's deemed worth saving. A cracked cup, a blunt knife, a scrap of cloth embroidered by a mother you never met. These are the treasures he clings to, and you can't help but feel you're just another object on that shelf, something he keeps because it was given to him, not because he ever wanted it. At last you lie down on your own straw mat, feeling the lumps and ridges press into your back. You listen to the old boards creak as the wind worries at the walls. You close your eyes, and in the darkness behind them, you imagine a place where fathers and children speak kindly to one another, where a simple goodnight doesn't feel like an impossible luxury. But this isn't that place. This is just the cottage, just the fire, just you and the knowledge that dawn will come whether you're ready or not. Morning arrives again, pale and half-hearted, leaking through the cracks in the walls like an apology you don't believe. You wake stiff and chilled, your limbs cramped from a night spent negotiating with the lumpy straw mat for some scrap of comfort. Your father is already up, standing near the door with his back to you, as though the sight of you asleep was too much irritation for him to endure. He's fastening his cloak, the same one patched so many times it looks like a quilt of old grievances. You watch the way his hands fumble at the frayed ties, and for a fleeting instant, he seems almost human in his tiredness. But when he turns, that moment vanishes like a candle snuffed by a draught. He doesn't greet you, of course. Greetings in this house are as rare as a loaf without mould. Instead, he informs you that the roof of the barn has leaked again, and you're to help him patch it before the next rain. His voice is flat, heavy as a stone dropped in a well, and you know better than to answer with anything but a nod. Anything more, and he might accuse you of backtalk. Anything less, and he'll accuse you of sulking. You follow him out into the morning, the cold air licking your cheeks with a sharpness that feels almost welcome. At least the weather is honest in its cruelty. The grass crunches under your boots, brittle with frost. The barn stands in its familiar slump, as if it has already accepted that no amount of repair will ever truly make it whole. You think you understand how it feels. He hands you the bundle of reeds and a wooden mallet, his expression as impassive as impassive. You climb onto the roof, the ladder trembling under your weight, and you wish for the 1000th time that he would say anything to acknowledge that this is hard, that you're trying. But all he offers is a curt reminder not to fall, as if your clumsiness is the most predictable tragedy he can imagine. Up on the slates you can see over the hedgerow to the fields beyond. Pale rows of stubble stretch to the horizon, a tired landscape that looks as though it has been exhaling for centuries. You tuck the reeds into the gaps and hammer them down, each stroke a quiet confession that you don't really know what you're doing. When you dare to glance down, he's watching with that same flat stare, as if he's already composing the list of things you'll have done wrong by the time you climb down. A gust of wind slides under your tunic, making you shiver so violently that for a moment you think you might slip. You catch yourself heart thudding and half hope he'll call out in alarm. But he doesn't. He only shifts his weight, folds his arms and waits. You realize then that even falling wouldn't change much. He would only sigh and say you should have been more careful. When you finish, you descend slowly, the ladder creaking in protest. He doesn't offer thanks or even a nod, just turns away, already moving on to the next small burden he will place in your hands. You look up at the patched roof and think about how it will probably leak again, how you will climb up here again, how the same ritual will repeat itself until the barn gives up, or you do. By afternoon, the sky has turned the colour of dishwater left too long in the basin, the sort of grey that presses down on your shoulders like a wet wool cloak. You're mending a fence this time, because in your father's world, there is always something broken, something that must be patched or propped up before the sun sets. He stands a few paces away, arms folded across his chest, supervising in the same way a buzzard supervises a dying sheep. You keep your eyes on the splintered rails, pretending not to notice the way he clears his throat every time you pause to wipe the cold sweat from your brow. You tell yourself you'll work faster, that if you drive the nails straight and true, he'll be satisfied. But some part of you already knows it doesn't matter how careful you are. The fence will sag again, and when it does, he'll blame you for building it poorly, as though the wood itself was an accomplice in your failings. You tap another nail into place, listening to the dull thud of the mallet. Each strike feels like an echo of every word he never spoke. No praise, no encouragement, just a hollow confirmation that this is all you are ever meant to be. For a moment, you imagine what it would feel like to stand up, drop the mallet, and tell him you're done, that you're tired of trying to earn approval that drifts further away the harder you reach for it. But the thought evaporates as quickly as it came, because you know that to speak up would only earn you that look, the one that slices deeper than any strap ever could. So you swallow your small rebellion and keep working, because at least if your hands are busy, you don't have to think so much about everything else. The wind picks up, rattling the loose boards with a sound like dry laughter. You wonder if the fence is mocking you too. You press your palm to the rough grain, feeling the splinters bite into your skin, and you think it's almost comforting proof that you can still feel something, even if it's only pain. Your father shifts his weight, the old leather of his boots creaking like a protest. He asks why you're so slow, and you want to tell him it's because you were never taught how to be fast, how to be sure, how to be anything but afraid of his disappointment. Instead, you say nothing. You tap in another nail, careful to keep your hand steady. The fence shudders under your touch, as if it knows it doesn't belong here any more than you do. The clouds overhead drift lower, threatening rain that will seep through the gaps in the roof, swell the wood until it splits, and give your father another reason to shake his head at you. You know this day will end like every other supper eaten in a silence so complete it feels like a punishment, the fire burning low while he stares into it, as if it might hold the answers to all the things he can't say. When the last board is in place, you step back, wiping your palms against your tunic. Your father doesn't thank you. He only inspects the fence with a look that says he's already counting the hours until it fails air. You stand there, wishing for a moment you could be as indifferent as the wood, but you can't. You feel everything, every sigh, every unsaid word, every tiny failure that somehow matters more than any effort you ever give. Imagine you are standing in the vaulted halls of an English castle, the air so cold it feels like the stones themselves are exhaling frost. A brazier smoulders nearby, producing more smoke than warmth, and you wonder why kings can't seem to afford better fires. Perhaps you expect this place to smell of polished wood and sweet incense, but the reality is more honest damp wool, stale rushes, and the sour tang of 1,000 anxious meals. This is where you will meet King John, a man who might have been born to rule, but somehow never managed to master the art of not disappointing everyone around him. You watch as he paces, his boots scuffing across the flagstones with a sound like a petulant drumbeat. He is not tall, not broad of shoulder, not especially regal in the way he carries himself. His robes hang a little loose, as though even his clothing doesn't quite trust him to fill the space. Maybe you expect him to bark orders or deliver rousing speeches, but he does neither. He mutters to himself, tallying grievances and perceived betrayals like a miser counting coppers he'll never spend. When he turns, you see the face that so many chroniclers try to describe: small eyes that flicker with a quick, fretful intelligence, a mouth that never seems to decide whether it wants to smile or sneer. You think that perhaps if you met him in the street, you'd mistake him for a nervous clerk rather than a king. But here he is, crowned and sullen, burdened by a kingdom he can't quite seem to love or manage. Servants approach cautiously, each one trying to guess whether he will be in the mood to issue commands or condemnations. The expectation, of course, is that a king will inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure, but the reality is less flattering. John inspires a sort of weary exasperation, as if everyone in his orbit has long accepted that no amount of deference will prevent him from accusing them of treachery before the day is out. You see it in the way the steward bows, spine curves so low he looks like he's about to fold in half, and still, you sense he's bracing for the inevitable outburst. John examines a scrap of parchment, fingers twitching along its edge, and announces that someone has stolen from the royal coffers. His voice is pitched high with irritation rather than fury, like a rooster trying to crow in a storm. He doesn't ask for explanations. He simply names a culprit, a knight who is conveniently absent, and decrees that more taxes will be collected to cover the loss. You expect the courtiers to protest, but they only nod, because in King John's England, disagreement is a dangerous luxury. The room holds its collective breath, as if hoping that this moment will pass without further demands. You notice the way John's gaze flickers from face to face, searching for signs of disloyalty he can punish. He finds none, or perhaps he simply grows bored. He waves a dismissive hand and declares he must retire to his chamber to consider new decrees, leaving behind the smell of his uneaten supper and the sense that nothing will ever be quite enough for him. You trail behind him as he stalks down the drafty corridor, his cloak dragging over the rushes with a dull whisper, like a reluctant apology for all the things he's about to do. The walls are hung with faded tapestries depicting battles he did not fight and victories that belonged to better men. You'd think the sight of such embroidered triumphs might inspire him, might remind him of the lineage he's meant to uphold. But if anything, they seem to make him smaller, shrinking him down to the sallow, narrow-shouldered figure he tries so hard to inflate into greatness. He stops at a heavy oak door, lays his palm against it, as if to steady himself, and then pushes it open into a chamber that smells of damp linen and the faint, acrid bite of lamp oil. The hearth is cold, the coals reduced to a handful of ash. He gestures for you to close the door behind him, as though it matters whether the rest of the castle hears the shape of his disappointment tonight. You oblige, feeling the latch click into place with a finality that seems to echo in your chest. Perhaps you imagine he will sit, gather his thoughts, and find some scrap of composure before addressing you. But no. He paces the length of the chamber, fingers tapping against the pommel of the dagger at his belt. He's not afraid, exactly, but there is something restless in his movements, a constant searching for enemies who might have hidden themselves in the folds of his own mind. You realize that for King John, suspicion is the only companion he trusts to stay close. At last he turns to face you, eyes pinched at the corners, as if he's been squinting into the future and finding it no more promising than the present. His voice is low, almost weary. When he starts to speak of loyalty, how it slips away like water through a sieve, how even the men who swear their lives to him will turn if the wind changes. You nod, though he's not really talking to you. He's talking to the cold air, to the ghosts of barons who refuse to bend, to the memory of a brother whose legend casts a long, unflattering shadow across everything he tries to build. He tells you that a king must be feared if he cannot be loved, and you see in the way his mouth tightens that he has resigned himself to one because the other was never offered. Maybe you expected this confession to sound triumphant, a man embracing ruthlessness as his birthright, but it comes out brittle, like a piece of dry wood cracking in the hearth. You think perhaps he says it aloud because if he doesn't, he risks believing it isn't true. The fireless grate gapes behind him, a black mouth waiting for someone to feed it. You wonder why he doesn't call for a servant to light it, but you suspect he prefers the chill, The cold gives him something to rail against that doesn't have a title or a claim to his lands. He draws the dagger, not to threaten you, but simply to hold it in his palm as if testing whether it's real, whether anything is real when so much of his reign feels like a performance that refuses to end. You stand there silent while he stares at the blade. In that moment, you understand that power doesn't always look like certainty. Sometimes it looks exactly like this: a man alone in a cold room, gripping a weapon that can't protect him from himself. The dagger's point glints dully in the lamplight, and you watch as he turns it over in his hand like a man testing the edge of a question he doesn't want answered. For a heartbeat, you almost expect him to speak some rare truth, to admit that the crown weighs heavier on his head than any enemy's threat. But the moment passes, dissolving like breath against cold glass, and he sheaths the blade with a sigh that manages to sound both irritated and defeated. He moves to the narrow table beneath the window, where a half-finished letter sprawls across a scrap of parchment. The ink has dried to the colour of old bruises. He picks up the quill, studies the words as if they've betrayed him somehow, and sets it down again. You suspect he has rewritten this message a dozen times already, searching for a tone that balances authority and desperation without letting either slip too far into view. It is the letter of a man who wants something he knows he will not get: loyalty, perhaps, or respect, or the illusion that he deserves either. Outside, the courtyard lies hushed under a thin skin of frost. You hear the horses shifting in their stalls, the faint clatter of a guard's pike against stone. Those small sounds feel larger in the silence of this chamber, where every sigh and scrape becomes evidence that the king's mind is never truly at rest. You can see why no one lingers here longer than duty demands. Even the tapestries seem to lean away from him, as if they'd rather not be witnesses to the endless catalogue of suspicions he recites in the dark. He begins to speak again, almost to himself, recounting how many times his barons have sworn fealty, and then turned their backs when it suited them. His voice takes on that thin, petulant edge you've heard before, the tone of a man who has never quite learned the difference between command and complaint. Perhaps you expected to feel sympathy, to see in him some reflection of your own fears of failing those who depend on you. But the truth is, his grievances wear the same dull shape as all his other pronouncements: heavy, repetitive, and too small for the throne he insists on defending. When he pauses, you realize he's waiting for you to agree. You nod, because anything else would be an invitation to another lecture on the fickleness of men and the virtues of ruling by fear. The air feels stale in your lungs, thick with the invisible residue of his disappointments. You want to open the window, to let some honest cold in to wash the taste of it away, but you already know he'd see that as an insult. He turns back to the table and, with a sudden, almost childish decisiveness, crumples the letter in his fist. The parchment creases with a sound like old bones. For a heartbeat, he looks at you as though he might explain himself, but then he simply drops the ball of paper into the dead hearth. The gesture seems to satisfy something in him, though you can't tell if it's relief or resignation. In the silence that follows, you realize that this room, this moment, is the purest shape of King John's reign, a man encircled by the evidence of his own dissatisfaction, convinced that no oath will ever hold, and no loyalty is ever more than a polite prelude to betrayal. At last he crosses the chamber to the tall back chair near the hearth, lowering himself onto the worn cushion with the stiffness of a man who has never trusted comfort to last. You watch as he clasps his hands in his lap, staring down at the faint scorch marks on the stones where the fire should be. Perhaps you expect that he will dismiss you now, wave a tired hand and send you scurrying back to whatever corner you came from. But he doesn't. Instead, he begins to speak in that measured tone he reserves for moments when he wants his words to feel weighty, though you suspect he's the only one convinced they do. He tells you of treaties broken before the ink had dried, of gifts sent across the channel to bribe men who smiled and nodded and betrayed him just the same. His voice carries that peculiar blend of injury and entitlement that you've come to recognize as his truest nature, a conviction that the world owes him not merely obedience but gratitude. As he talks, you feel the room shrink around you, every story a stone added to the walls he builds between himself and everyone else. You would like to believe there is some warmth hidden in the telling, some faint attempt to explain why he is as he is, but the longer he speaks, the clearer it becomes that he is not confessing anything. He is just rehearsing the same litany he has recited to any ear willing to listen. Maybe you expected this to feel like history unfolding a king, laying bare the secret pains of power, but it feels more like standing in a draft while someone reads aloud the inventory of his grudges. He rubs his thumb along the edge of his signet ring, as if the gold itself might remind him who he is meant to be. The movement is so small, so unguarded, that for a moment you almost see the boy he must have been once, anxious, ambitious, desperate to prove he could fill the space his brother left behind. But then the flicker passes, and you are left with the same careful mask that never quite fits. When he pauses, you realize he expects you to say something reassuring. Perhaps he hopes you'll tell him he was right to mistrust everyone, that his endless suspicion is a mark of prudence rather than a slow poison he administers to his own authority. You open your mouth, but no words come. What comfort could you offer that wouldn't sound hollow in this cold, smoky air? In the end, you only incline your head, a gesture that could mean anything or nothing at all. He seems satisfied, or at least no more dissatisfied than usual, and shifts in his chair, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. The silence stretches out again, filled with the quiet knowledge that neither of you is truly speaking to the other. He sighs, the sound thin as parchment, and mutters that no king can afford to trust too deeply. You think he believes this is wisdom, but all you hear is the confession of a man who has never learned how to believe in anyone, even himself. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters with a noise like distant applause for a performance you wish would end. You look at him, sitting there with his complaints and his careful solitude, and you understand why so many people leave his presence feeling smaller than when they arrived. Eventually he rises again, moving with a stiffness that seems to have less to do with age than with the weight of grudges he refuses to set down. You follow as he drifts toward the narrow window, the cold seeping in around the warped wooden frame until it feels like you're breathing the damp brie. Outside, the yard is hushed under the press of evening mist, a pale, clinging damp that makes the stones look as though they are dissolving slowly back into the earth. You imagine he must find the view comforting in some small, private way, a landscape as tired and intractable as he is. He stands there, one hand braced on the sill, staring out into the darkness that thickens between the barns and the distant tree line. You half expect that he'll begin cataloguing his grievances again, perhaps recount another list of names that have failed him. Instead, he says nothing, his breath fogging the glass in faint, intermittent blooms that fade as quickly as they form. For a moment, the silence almost feels companionable, the kind of hush that suggests a shared understanding you've never been able to find with him before. But it doesn't last. It never does. At length he speaks, his voice soft enough you have to lean forward to catch it. He says he wonders whether the land itself is tired of him, whether the fields resent his taxes, the forests despise the timbers he's ordered felled, the rivers dream of flooding his works away. The thought seems to startle him, and you see the way his fingers tighten on the window ledge, as though he might steady himself against the idea that some forces cannot be bullied into obedience. You think perhaps he is about to laugh at his own fancy, but instead he simply shakes his head and mutters that a king can't afford to be sentimental. You nod, though part of you wonders if sentiment isn't the one thing he's never been able to abandon, no matter how he pretends otherwise. His entire life has been a study in disappointed hope, every triumph shadowed by the certainty that it would never be enough to outshine the memory of better kings. You watch him in profile, the lamplight catching the lines etched into his face, creases worn deeper by suspicion than by any honest toil. It's strange to think that a man who has claimed so much land, so much power, can look so much like he's perpetually waiting to be called an imposter. The wind stirs outside, ruffling the rushes piled against the threshold. He draws back from the window, wrapping his cloak tighter, as though the draught has reminded him there are still small discomforts in this world to be conquered. When he turns to you, his expression is blank again, all trace of doubt buried beneath the flat certainty he wears like armor. He tells you to see that the guards are posted along the southern wall, that the gatehouse is locked, that no man enters or leaves without his word. The instructions are clear, precise, the voice of a ruler accustomed to being obeyed in these small matters, if in nothing else. As you bow, you can't help noticing how quickly the softness has vanished, replaced by the brittle edge of command. You realize this is the rhythm of his life, small cracks of humanity opening in the dark, only to be sealed over the moment someone might glimpse them. You straighten, the chill of the window still in your bones, and step back into the corridor, thinking that perhaps the saddest truth about this king is that he never learned that ruling begins not with fear, but with the quiet discipline of trust. You slip out into the corridor, your boots brushing across the rush-strewn floor, and the door closes behind you with a sound that feels heavier than it should, as though the air itself is glad to be rid of the conversation you've just left. The guards posted along the walls straighten as you pass, their faces carefully blank in the way of men who have learned that neutrality is safer than curiosity in a household ruled by suspicion. You nod to them, and they nod back, the entire exchange a quiet ritual of deference that means almost nothing and yet carries the weight of survival. As you make your way toward the gatehouse, you think about the list of instructions he rattled off with such brittle precision. It occurs to you that he trusts the walls more than he trusts the people who walk within them, that he feels safer relying on iron latches and watchful eyes than on any oath spoken aloud. Perhaps you expected that a king would take comfort in the loyalty of his subjects, that he would rest easier knowing men had pledged to defend him. But in King John's England, the pledge is never enough. He must see it enforced, written down, inspected twice, and witnessed by at least 3 others, or it counts for nothing. The night outside has settled in with the peculiar dampness that seeps into the seams of your clothing and clings to your skin like a reminder that no fire burns forever. You pull your cloak tighter and step into the gatehouse, where the torches sputter in their brackets, coughing smoke into the stale air. The guards here are young, their faces drawn and sallow from too many hours watching the darkness for threats that almost never materialize. One of them steps forward, bowing low, and asks whether the king has further orders. You can see the question in his eyes, the flicker of fear that wonders whether he's been accused of something already. You shake your head, repeating the instructions you've been given in the same flat tone you heard them delivered. The guard nods, though his relief is tempered by the knowledge that tomorrow may bring a new accusation, a fresh suspicion that will need defending against. You feel a twinge of something you can't quite name, pity, perhaps, or the dull ache of recognizing your own exhaustion in someone else's eyes. For a moment you think about telling him it isn't personal, that the king's mistrust isn't aimed at him in particular, but you know how hollow that would sound. In this place, suspicion is the air everyone breathes. When you step back out into the yard, you pause beneath the eaves of the nearest stable, listening to the soft, rhythmic sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls. You wonder if they, too, feel the weight of all this watchfulness, or if they simply accept the darkness for what it is, unfriendly but honest. You find yourself envying them their simple purpose. No horse has ever been blamed for ambition or betrayal. You take a breath, tasting the cold on your tongue, and look up at the battlements where a single torch guttering in the wind seems determined to hold its small circle of light against the night. You think of the king alone in his chamber, clutching his memories and his bitterness as though they were treasures worth hoarding. And you understand, in a way you never wanted to, how a man can wrap himself so tightly in suspicion that he forgets any other warmth ever existed. You make your way along the wall walk, the torches flickering low in their iron brackets, each one producing more shadow than illumination. The wind cuts across the battlements in thin, slicing currents that feel like they might peel the skin from your cheeks if you stood still too long. Down in the courtyard, a few men huddle near the stables, their voices hushed to that particular tone people use when they believe walls have ears. You wonder if they're trading stories about the King Small, muttered tales that make sense of a reign no one fully understands but everyone endures. You pause at the parapet, resting your gloved hands on the damp stones. The land beyond the walls is dark, the fields and woods blending together in one seamless mass of uncertainty. It strikes you how fitting it is that a man so obsessed with control presides over a kingdom that becomes unknowable the instant the sun goes down. You imagine that if you told him this observation, he'd accuse you of disrespect or treachery. He's never been fond of any truth that arrives uninvited. Turning back, you catch sight of the keep's upper window, a narrow slit of yellow light in an ocean of gloom. You know without question he's up there still, pacing the same short path between his chair and the hearth, weighing every possibility like a merchant counting coins he suspects might be counterfeit. Perhaps you expect that in private he might set down the mantle of suspicion for a while, that he might look around and see something other than enemies and unfinished tasks, but you suspect he doesn't know how to put it away anymore, if he ever did. The guard nearest you clears his throat, and you realize you've been standing there longer than you meant to. You nod, as if that explains something, and move on toward the far turret, where a brazier burns with a sullen red glow. A soldier is crouched beside it, warming his hands, his face pinched with a tiredness that doesn't look entirely physical. When he glances up at you, you see the dull resignation that seems to settle over every man who serves too near the king. It's the expression of someone who has learned there is no correct way to be useful, only less noticeable ways to fail. He asks if you have new orders, and you almost laugh because you realize how absurd it is, this constant expectation that more commands will arrive, more instructions to shore up a fortress already bristling with defenses no one has threatened in years. You shake your head, tell him to stay at his post, and he nods with the grim obedience of a man who has forgotten how to hope for anything but an uneventful night. You step back from the brazier, feeling the cold rush in to reclaim the small warmth you borrowed. Overhead, clouds shift across the moon, revealing a landscape that looks almost peaceful if you let your eyes blur at the edges. But you know that peace, like trust, is a luxury this king will never afford himself. And because he will not, neither will you, nor any of the men who spend their nights watching the darkness for threats that look suspiciously like their own reflections. When you finally turn back toward the keep, the path seems longer than it should, each step across the frost-rimed stones carrying the weight of everything unsaid. You might have thought that a king's fortress would feel reassuring, that the tall towers and iron gates would stand as proof that order is possible if you simply build the walls high enough. But here, the fortifications feel less like protection and more like the outward shape of a mind that cannot rest, paranoid, constricted, convinced that enemies are forever pressing just beyond the threshold. Inside, the hall is dim, lit only by a few tallow candles that lean in their holders like exhausted sentries. The air smells of stale rushes, smoke, and the metallic tang of old weaponry, as though the room itself has absorbed centuries of arguments and preparations for wars that never quite arrived. You pause at the threshold, hoping that perhaps he has found some peace in the hours you've been gone. But the hope collapses as soon as you hear the low scrape of his boot against the flagstones. He is pacing again, measuring out the same short span of floorboards in steps so regular they sound like an accusation. He doesn't look up when you enter. He only speaks, his voice pitched to that peculiar register between complaint and command. He asks whether the gates are so secure, whether the torches are burning, whether the men are alert. You answer each question in the same even tone, careful not to let any impatience seep through, because you already know he hears challenge in every inflection he does not recognize. When you finish, he finally stops pacing, though you can see in the restless twitch of his fingers that he would rather keep moving. You might imagine that he would thank you, or at least acknowledge the simple fact that you have done what he asked. But gratitude is as rare here as warmth. Instead, he begins to talk again, his words unspooling in the same weary patterned lists of names he does not trust, places where loyalty has frayed, moments he suspects were orchestrated to embarrass him. It's as though he believes that by reciting these injuries often enough, he can transform them into proof that he is right to stand alone. For a while, you listen because you must. The cold seeps back into your bones as you watch the way his shoulders stiffen with every recollection, each memory another stone he hoists onto the wall he has built around his own heart. You think about the stories they tell in the village's tales of noble kings, whose generosity could heal wounds and settle disputes, and you wonder how anyone ever convinced themselves he belonged among their number. At last he falls silent. He draws a breath, long and ragged, and for a moment you almost expect him to look up and see you. But instead, he closes his eyes and murmurs that no one can be trusted entirely, not even those who swear their lives to your service. The words hang between you like frost in the lamplight, a quiet confession that would be pitiable if it didn't feel so inevitable. You stand there, knowing he is right in a way he never intended. In this place, trust has been worn so thin it crumbles at a touch, and loyalty is little more than the habit of obedience. You wait in the hush that follows, a hush so complete you can hear the low creak of the rafters above and the muffled steps of some servant hurrying down the far passage, hoping to remain unseen. He doesn't open his eyes, doesn't turn toward you or the hearth, which has long since cooled to a scatter of ashy remnants. For a moment, you wonder if he is even fully present, or simply drifting somewhere in the labyrinth of old injuries that he carries like a reliquary. You almost speak, almost venture some small reassurance that would mean nothing but might at least fill the silence, but you stop yourself because you already know he would hear it as condescension. Instead, you stand still, hands clasped behind your back, and watch the rise and fall of his shoulders. He breathes with the slow, uneven rhythm of someone fighting sleep he does not trust. You might expect a king to find solace in the certainty of his walls and the loyalty of the men who guard them. But here, certainty is always provisional, loyalty always a currency to be weighed and measured. You think that if you stayed here long enough, you too would learn to doubt everything that ever claimed to be dependable. After a while, he stirs, blinking as though surfacing from some grey dream. He glances at you, the look neither welcoming nor dismissive, just a dull acknowledgement that you are there, a piece of furniture that can answer questions. His voice is hoarse when he begins again, cataloguing which barons have offered tribute and which have delayed, which clerics have spoken in his favour and which have dared to question his edicts. The litany spills out in the same tone he might use to recite a rosary list, but you can hear the undertone of something brittle anger, perhaps, or fear so deeply embedded it has hardened into habit. He pauses to rub his eyes, the gesture as weary as it is familiar. You imagine he has done this thousands of times, alone in this chamber, with no one to contradict his sense that the world has conspired to disappoint him. You wish, for a moment, that you could tell him the truth he refuses to see, that even if every oath were sincere, he would still find a way to mistrust it. But you keep your thoughts silent as you always do. Some truths are less dangerous unspoken. When he finally looks up, there is a glimmer in his expression you almost mistake for relief. He tells you, in a voice that barely carries, that no king can afford sentiment, that affection is a crack in the armour waiting to be split wide. You nod, though the words settle in your chest like a small, unwelcome stone. Perhaps you believe he is trying to convince you of something, but more likely he is simply trying to convince himself. You step closer, enough to see the faint sheen of exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slope under the invisible burden he never sets aside. You want to ask whether he remembers a time before suspicion became the only language he spoke, but instead, you bow, the movement smooth and automatic, and wait for dismissal. The moment stretches out, long and brittle, before he waves a tired hand and turns away. You leave the chamber quietly, feeling as though you have just witnessed something too private to name, and too familiar to forget. When you step back into the corridor, the air feels as though it has been waiting for you to leave, like a held breath finally released. The torches sputter along the walls, their light too weak to banish the shadows that gather in every corner. You pause, letting your eyes adjust to the gloom, and think that perhaps the darkness here is less about the hour and more about the nature of this place, a fortress built not merely of stone but of the convictions of a man who believes that trust is an affliction. You make your way down the long gallery where faded banners hang in limp folds, each one a reminder of victories claimed in other reigns. The colours are dull, the fabric thinning, and you wonder if the king ever looks at them and imagines himself among their triumphs, or if he has accepted that no embroidery will ever depict him as anything more than a footnote to his brother's legend. You suspect he tells himself he does not care, but the way he recites every slight suggests otherwise. At the far end of the passage, you pause beside a narrow table where a ledger lies open, ink drying to the colour of old bruises. It lists rents collected, taxes levied, debts owed, numbers that he counts obsessively, as though the sum of coins might prove that he has achieved something no one can deny. You touch the edge of the parchment, feeling its roughness under your fingertips, and think that perhaps this is the closest thing to reassurance he has left, the cold certainty that money will do what loyal Hassan never has. When you finally descend the stairs to the lower hall, you find a pair of servants waiting by the door, their shoulders drawn tight, their eyes fixed on the floor. You know without asking that they've been summoned and dismissed more times tonight than they can count, each errand a performance of obedience that never ends with satisfaction. You might expect that service in a royal household would feel dignified, even purposeful, but here it feels more like treading water in a river that never stops rising. One of them dares a glance in your direction, his expression cautious, almost apologetic. You think he wants to ask whether the king is finished for the night, whether there will be more summonses, more questions, more instructions delivered in that low, suspicious tone. But he doesn't speak, and you don't answer, because neither of you can pretend this is anything but the routine of a man who cannot sleep without first inventorying every imagined betrayal. You step past them into the courtyard, where the cold has deepened into something almost respectable and honest chill that feels cleaner than any of the air inside. You take a breath and let it fill your lungs, tasting frost and wood smoke, and something sharper that you recognize as relief. For all the hours you spend in his presence, you never stop feeling the moment you escape, as though it were an accomplishment in itself. Looking back at the high window of his chamber, you can just make out the flicker of lamplight, a single point of brightness in the gloom. You wonder if he is still pacing, still tallying grievances, still convincing himself that suspicion is the only weapon that will not turn against him. And you realize, with a small and guilty certainty, that he is probably right. For a man who believes trust is a flaw, suspicion is the only company he can count on to stay. You find yourself in a small chamber that smells of old vellum and the faint, inescapable tang of mildew that seeps into every corner, no matter how many rushes are changed. The table before you is littered with letters, some brittle as dried leaves, others folded so many times they've taken on the shape of a clenched fist. Maybe you expect these scraps of writing to be full of noble sentiments, a testament to the enduring bonds between parent and child. But as you smooth the first one open, you realize these letters carry something far less polished, the quiet, relentless ache of disappointment. The ink on the page is brown and flaking, but the words are still legible enough to prick at you. A son writes to a father who never answered the last 3 messages. He lists the things he has done in the hope of approval dues paid to the guild, apprentices taken, fields cleared of stones that never seem to end. The sentences start confidently, each a small attempt to prove worth, but by the time you reach the final lines, they have collapsed into something smaller, thinner. You almost hear the voice behind them shrinking, the words curling in on themselves like a leaf scorched at the edges. You unfold another letter, the wax seal cracked into 3 ragged shards. This one is from a daughter, and though she does not say it outright, you can read between the lines the same hunger for acknowledgement. She describes the linen she has woven, the cheeses she has traded, the candles she has moulded to pay off the debts her father left behind. There is a moment, halfway down the page, when she dares to ask whether he still remembers the promises he made before he left. The question sits there, a single sentence that feels heavier than all the rest combined. Perhaps you think you are prepared for the plainness of these disappointments, but each letter has its own peculiar gravity, the way a cold hearth holds the memory of a fire long gone out. Some are bitter, others careful not to seem ungrateful, but all of them share the same thin thread of hope stretched to near breaking. You feel it as you turn each page, the fragile insistence that if you just find the right words, someone will finally see you. You pick up a folded scrap that has no seal at all, the parchment rubbed nearly smooth by the handling of uncertain hands. It is short, just a few lines in a hurried script. A young man writes that he will not be returning for the feast. He doesn't say why, but you can read the answer in every cramped letter. He has nothing left to bring, nothing left to prove, and no more illusions to protect. For all its brevity, the note feels like a closing door, the quiet finality of a bond that has worn itself out trying to matter. Setting it aside, you look around the little chamber and think how strange it is that so many voices, so many small hopes and grievances, could be left here to fade into dust. Perhaps that is the final disappointment, not that these words were written in vain, but that no one thought them worth remembering. You pick up another letter, the parchment so thin it feels, as if your breath alone might tear it. The script is precise but small, as though the writer worried about taking up too much space, even on a page. It begins with a formal greeting to my honoured father, words that try very hard to sound respectful, but sag under their own weight before the first line ends. You read on and discover the same familiar shape, a litany of efforts rendered invisible, accomplishments greeted with silence, small victories overlooked, because they were not the triumphs someone else imagined. The writer lists his work with a kind of determined dignity that makes you ache on his behalf. 3 harvests brought in without borrowing seed, a new roof on the house, a wife who came with her own dowry, even if it was only a pair of goats and a pot of cracked pewter. These details should have been enough to earn to at least a nod of acknowledgement, but the way he circles back to them again and again, like a man knocking on a door he already knows won't open, tells you that no such nod ever came. You set the parchment aside and choose another letter, this one darker with age, the ink turned almost black. The handwriting is round and steady, and you can tell at once it was a woman's. She writes to her father from a convent, her sentences stitched together with the same careful neatness she probably used to embroider altar cloths. She describes the quiet routines of the nuns, the hours spent in prayer and silence, but there is a line that breaks the rhythm so completely it feels like stepping onto uncertain ground. She says she wonders if he was glad when she entered holy orders, because it meant he no longer had to find her a husband. The question is so plain that it leaves you unsettled, as though you've overheard something never meant to be spoken aloud. Perhaps you expect the letter to end with absolution or acceptance, some small sign that the years have softened her resentment. But the last lines are only a polite wish for his health, and a closing salutation as stiff as a board. You think about how many daughters were sent to convents as solutions rather than choices, how many fathers congratulated themselves on arranging such tidy resolutions, and you wonder if any of them ever understood that an obedient daughter can still carry a quiet, enduring bitterness. Turning to the next letter, you find only a fragment, a torn scrap bearing half a sentence, and a name smudged almost to invisibility. You can't be sure what it once said. Perhaps it was an apology. Perhaps it was the beginning of another list of unmet expectations. Or maybe it was the last attempt to close a distance that had grown too wide to cross. You run your thumb across the ragged edge, feeling the way the parchment yields slightly, as though it remembers being separated from the rest. In this small room, surrounded by these silent witnesses to ordinary heartbreak, you begin to understand how disappointment can outlast every other feeling. These letters survived not because they were treasured, but because no one thought to burn them. You think that might be the saddest thing of all, that sometimes what endures is not love, but the record of its absence. You lift a folded sheet that still bears the faint wax stain of a seal long pried apart, its edges crumbling under your thumb. The handwriting here is less careful, a spidery sprawl that crosses the page in urgent lines. It begins with a greeting, father, as plain and undecorated as a cold hearth. What follows is not a list of accomplishments, but a defense, a string of explanations laid out like stepping stones over the murky pond of some unspoken accusation. He writes of the debts he did not intend to incur, of the neighbours who refused to extend credit, of the bad season that left the fields so thin you could see more dirt than barley. There is a line where he insists he did everything he could, and you can almost feel the tightness in his chest as he scratched the words across the parchment, desperate to be believed. You wonder whether he imagined his father reading this by candlelight, frowning over each sentence and deciding, finally, that nothing here excused the failure. You set the letter down and rub your eyes, feeling the weight of so many small voices, each straining to reach across time and guilt for something as simple as understanding. Maybe you expect these confessions to feel repetitive, but each carries its own small shade of sorrow, a particular loneliness shaped by the writer's hope that words might change what reality never has. The next letter you choose is shorter, but no less heavy. A daughter writes to her father in a hand so neat it looks almost like printed script, each letter formed with patient precision. She begins by telling him that her new husband is kind enough, but that she sometimes dreams of the days when she was still in her father's hall, when her world was small and hopes felt less like fragile things. She does not accuse him of marrying her off for convenience, but the implication settles in the space between her lines like dust in an empty room. There is no bitterness in her words, only a softness that feels more dangerous for being so gentle a resignation that sounds suspiciously like regret. When you reach the end, you find the closing is nothing more than a polite farewell. No plea for reply, no question of whether he remembers her laughter, no request for reassurance. You think that, in some ways, the absence of any such petition says more than a page of complaint ever could. She has stopped expecting anything. The quiet finality of it makes you feel as though you have stumbled upon the last ember of a fire that everyone else forgot to notice had gone out. You lean back in your chair and let the letter rest across your palm. Around you, the little chamber seems to close in, heavy with the accumulated hush of all these voices that never quite reached their intended ear. You realize that disappointment does not always announce itself with anger or tears. Sometimes it settles like silt, layer upon layer, until the weight of it is enough to keep any hope pinned beneath it forever. You reach for another folded sheet, this one so brittle it threatens to break apart in your hands. You ease it open with the same care you'd give a wounded bird, half afraid that even your breath might scatter it into irretrievable pieces. The handwriting inside is cramped, the ink faded to the colour of old tea. It begins without any greeting at all, just a line that starts mid-thought, as if the writer could not be bothered with pleasantries when there was so much that needed saying. The first words are an apology, though it feels more like a formality than any true regret. He writes that he has left the manor, that he will not be coming back, that he is tired of waiting for a word of approval that never arrives. You read on, and each sentence lands with the dull weight of a hammer striking wood, measured and final. He does not bother to justify himself or to soften the edges of his departure. It is simply a declaration that he has finished pretending to believe a father's love will someday reveal itself. You pause over the line where he writes that he is going to the city, where no one knows his name, and no one knows his name, and no one will expect him to measure up to a standard he never agreed to in the first place. For a moment you feel the small, cold thrill of envy this unremarkable young man deciding that disappointment is not a chain he must drag behind him forever. You imagine him stepping away from the house at dawn, the frost still crisp on the grass, the familiar shape of the roof growing smaller with every step he takes. When you set the letter down, the room seems even quieter, as though the air itself has absorbed the knowledge that sometimes hope dies not in some grand betrayal, but in the slow erosion of faith. You pick up another page, this one sealed with a blob of grey wax stamped with the faint impression of a crest you can't quite make out. The script is smaller, more deliberate. A daughter, writing from her husband's household, thanks her father for sending the dowry he promised. She describes the new hall she keeps, the servant she manages, the respect her husband shows her in front of guests. But woven through all the careful descriptions is an unmistakable thread of loneliness and emptiness that feels less like an accident and more like something that has been quietly, methodically cultivated. Perhaps you expect her to end on a hopeful note, to tell herself the absence of affection is a price worth paying for security. But her last sentence is a small admission that she misses the sound of the house when she was a girl, the way it felt to believe she was loved without conditions. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the ghost of her longing settle across your shoulders like a thin blanket that does nothing to keep out the cold. You look around this little chamber of forgotten words and wonder how many other voices remain folded away in the dark, still waiting to be heard, still hoping to be understood. It occurs to you that some disappointments are so ordinary no one bothers to record them properly, and that perhaps this is why they last the longest. You shift the small pile of letters, feeling the dry weight of them against your palm, and select a folded scrap that looks as though it has been opened and read so many times the creases have nearly worn through. You smooth it carefully on the table and see that it begins not with any greeting but with a simple, stark sentence, "I have done what you asked." The words have no flourish, no apology, no explanation. They are as blunt and cold as a door closing. The writer goes on to list the tasks he completed: a field cleared, debts settled, a younger brother apprenticed to a tradesman in a distant town. Each line is tidy, factual, scrubbed of anything that might betray how it felt to be handed these responsibilities in place of affection. Perhaps you expect to find some small plea tucked into the margins, a hidden hope that all this dutiful labour might finally earn a crumb of praise. But if such a hope existed, it has been buried too deep to leave a trace. You reach the last sentence, and for a moment you almost miss it. So small and plain it seems like an afterthought. I will not write again. You look at the words for a long moment, feeling the quiet certainty that no further explanation was needed. Some relationships do not end with an argument or a betrayal. Some simply wear themselves out on the grindstone of expectation. You imagine the father reading this letter, perhaps frowning, perhaps shrugging, perhaps feeling nothing at all. You wonder which would be worse. Lifting the page aside, you find another beneath it, a daughter's letter written in a looping hand so fine it almost disguises the edge beneath the words. She writes of her marriage, a union arranged when she was too young to understand that the word duty could be twisted into something unrecognizable. She describes her new home with studied politeness, the hearth always warm, the table always set, the husband always civil. But the sentences are brittle, like thin ice over dark water, and you know without needing her to say it outright that she feels as though she's been bartered away like a spare bolt of cloth. Toward the end, her tone softens in a way that feels almost more wounding than any accusation. She thanks her father for the education that taught her how to speak properly to strangers, how to smile without meaning it, how to bear silence without complaint. She closes with the hope that he is well, and the certainty that she will not trouble him further. You can almost see her lowering the pen with a hand that no longer trembles, as though she has finally realized there is no point in asking for a tenderness that was never hers to claim. You set the letter down with a care that feels insufficient to the weight of it. The chamber feels smaller now, as if the walls themselves have inched closer to listen to these voices that never found the ears they were meant for. You wonder how many other letters like these lie hidden in old chests and forgotten archives, small testaments to the fact that sometimes the most ordinary thing in the world is a child learning how to stop hoping. The next letter you choose is heavier than the others, written on a thicker parchment that feels almost defiant in your hand, as if it refuses to fade, no matter how many years have tried to wear it thin. The seal is still half intact, a wax impression of a crest you do not recognize, though the image is so blurred it might as well be the memory of authority rather than its proof. You break it open carefully, expecting another careful catalogue of grievances wrapped in courtesy. Instead, what you find is something closer to a confession. The writer begins abruptly, as if he has decided that formalities are a luxury he can no longer afford. He writes that he has failed in nearly everything he was expected to become: the steward who could manage the land without complaint, the son who could shoulder the burden of a name that meant less with each passing season, the man who could look his father in the eye without feeling the slow, familiar swell of resentment. The sentences are long, unhurried, as though he is determined to leave no corner of his regret unexplored. You read on, feeling the weight of every line press against your chest in that peculiar way disappointment always does, subtle at first, then so total it becomes a kind of hush. He does not ask for forgiveness, nor does he offer any. Instead, he names every moment he believes he has fallen short, the harvest ruined by his indecision, the debt he could not repay, the brother he envied so completely it turned every greeting into an accusation. Perhaps you expect the confession to rise into some plea for understanding, but it never does. He simply lays out each failing like stones across a riverbed, then steps back to let them be seen for what they are. Near the end, his tone shifts so subtly you almost miss it. He writes that he no longer believes any apology will bridge the space between them, that silence has become the only language they share. It is not a dramatic declaration, not an accusation sharpened into blame, just a flat statement of fact that feels heavier than any bitterness. You imagine him sitting in a small chamber much like this one, the candle burning low, the cold creeping in through the cracks, and thinking that at least in writing the words down, he has finally done one thing completely. You close the letter and set it aside with the others. Around you, the room feels different now, not merely quiet, but thick with the presence of voices that once tried to reach across the gap between hope and disappointment. You pick up the last letter in the pile, the parchment soft and worn at the corners. It is addressed simply, to the man who raised me. There is no title, no honorific, no attempt to pretend a respect that was never freely given. You think that honesty in its plainness can sometimes feel as cutting as any carefully measured insult. The first line is as direct as a blade. You taught me what love was by showing me everything it was not. You pause there, the words settling into you with a slow, unavoidable certainty. For a moment you think you might not be able to read any further. But you do, because even in their sadness, these letters deserve to be heard. You smooth the last letter flat across the table, the parchment soft as old cloth where so many fingers must have pressed it open, hoping to read something that would finally feel like the truth. The ink is faded but clear enough to follow, each word carved in a hand that is neither hurried nor hesitant. You read the opening line again. You taught me what love was by showing me everything it was not, and you think that no more honest sentence has ever been written in this dim little chamber. The writer does not bother with any preamble. She begins at once, describing the small humiliations that accumulated until they became a permanent condition, the chores she completed without being thanked, the days she spent waiting for a word of approval that never arrived, the nights when she heard her father praising the sons of other men while pretending not to see her standing in the doorway, hoping that tonight might be different. The sentences are steady, each one carrying its own measure of weariness that no amount of time has been able to soften. You read on, and it feels as though you are eavesdropping on something so private you have no right to witness it. But you keep going, because there is something in her voice that insists on being heard. She writes that when she left to marry, she thought she would finally feel relief that being someone's wife might erase the sensation of being someone's disappointment. But she discovered that absence does not undo the things it leaves behind. In her husband's house, she learned how easily silence can follow you, how it can set up its own quarters in your chest and refuse to be dislodged. Perhaps you expect the letter to end with accusation, with some final condemnation meant to wound and made her feel so small. But when you reach the last paragraph, you find nothing but a strange, quiet grace. She writes that she no longer blames him, because she has come to understand that he, too, was taught to measure worth in small, hard increments. She says she hopes he finds peace someday, though she no longer waits for any sign that he has. You set the letter down and sit back, feeling the weight of it settle into you like a stone dropped into water. You think about all the moments that go unrecorded, small gestures never offered, kind words never spoken, and how they leave their own kind of inheritance behind. In this place, surrounded by these crumbling scraps of regret, you begin to suspect that disappointment is not always an event, but sometimes just the slow accumulation of everything withheld. Your eyes drift across the table, over the stack of letters you've unfolded, each one a testament to the same quiet hunger, the need to be seen, to be valued, to be forgiven for never becoming exactly what someone else hoped. You find yourself wishing that any of these writers had received a reply, some small assurance that they were more than a ledger of shortcomings. But the absence of answers is its own story, as clear as any ink. You gather the letters carefully, stacking them together as though they might comfort each other in the dark. And you think that if ghosts exist, they must sound something like this, not angry, not accusing, just tired voices repeating what they needed to hear until the walls themselves remember. You rest your hands on the table for a moment, feeling the uneven grain beneath your palms, and wonder how many more letters like these exist, folded away in chests no one bothers to open. The room is quiet, except for the occasional groan of the old beams overhead and the soft hiss of a candle guttering in its holder. You take another sheet from the pile, this one folded twice and tied with a length of thread, so thin it seems miraculous it hasn't snapped under the weight of so much time. The parchment is stiff when you unfold it, the creases stubborn as old habits. The script is elegant but tight, as though the writer was determined to say only what needed saying and not one word more. It begins, "Father, I hope you will read this entire letter before deciding what to think of me." You can almost hear the tremor in the voice that wrote it, the careful plea hidden under the formal address. It is a plea not for forgiveness, but for the simple decency of being listened to. He writes that he is leaving, not out of rebellion, but because he has finally understood that no amount of duty can fill the hollow space where affection was supposed to be. He describes the years spent in the fields, in the counting house, in the dull, repetitive cycle of proving and failing and trying again. He He says that he is tired of measuring his worth in bushels harvested and debts repaid, tired of pretending that a father's silence is anything but a verdict. You read to the end, where he signs his name without any closing benediction. It feels deliberate, as if he has decided that politeness is just another form of self-betrayal. You think about how many people spend their whole lives trying to soften their own truths to make them palatable for someone who will never taste them. There is something bracing in the way he refuses to do so. You set it aside and reach for the next letter, this one written in a smaller, more delicate hand. A daughter writes to the man she still calls father, though she admits it no longer feels true. She writes that she has a child of her own now, and that she cannot imagine ever making her feel so uncertain. The words are plain, almost gentle, but they carry the peculiar sting of honesty that leaves no room for protest. She does not say she is angry. She only says she has learned, at last, how to love without conditions, and that she is sorry he never knew how to show her it was possible. Perhaps you expect her to ask for some sign that he remembers her with any fondness, but there is no such request. Instead, she ends with a single line that feels more final than any farewell. I will not teach my daughter to mistake duty for love. You read the sentence twice, feeling the shape of it settle into you like a weight you did not ask to carry. You place the letter with the others and look around the dim chamber, the walls blurring a little at the edges. In this silence, you feel the presence of all the voices that have ever tried to reach beyond disappointment and found only more of it. And you understand, perhaps for the first time, that sometimes the hardest thing is not leaving, but realizing you were already gone long before you stepped away. You draw another letter toward you, feeling the fragile edge of the parchment snag against your thumb, a small, defiant reminder that even the softest things can bite when you don't handle them carefully. The wax seal has been lost to time, but a dark stain where it once clung remains, a smudge of formality that did nothing to protect the words it held shut. The writing here is different, less tidy, less measured, more the hand of someone who has decided that caution is no longer worth the price. Father, it begins, and you almost expect the next words to be an apology. But instead, the line continues with the quiet accusation. I have come to understand that the measure of a man is not in the land he holds or the taxes he collects, but in how he leaves his children to remember him. The sentence sits on the page like a stone, immovable and cold. You read on, drawn in by the way each line seems to carve deeper into some unspoken ledger neither father nor son had the courage to open while they still shared a roof. He writes of winters spent watching the roof leak onto the table, of the mornings he rose before dawn to mend what his father never noticed was broken. He remembers standing in the field, so young he could barely lift the hoe, while his father looked past him as if he were only another piece of farm equipment, useful, replaceable, not quite human. Each memory is recited without embellishment, each a small indictment delivered in a voice that no longer expects a reply. Perhaps you expect the letter to build toward reconciliation, some last-minute recognition that family is a bond stronger than disappointment, but you already sense, by the time you reach the middle, that this is no such letter. This is the record of a man who has stopped believing in redemption and simply wants the truth to be known. You read the closing lines and feel something shift in your chest. I will not waste my days waiting for you to see me. I have seen myself, and that is enough. You fold the letter slowly and set it aside, though the feeling of it does not leave your hands. You choose another, written in a delicate hand that loops gracefully across the page. This one begins almost tenderly, dearest father, but the endearment feels more like habit than sentiment. She describes her life in the manor where she now lives, the duties she performs with a diligence she learned watching him demand more than anyone could ever give. She lists the candles she has poured, the accounts she has balanced, the children she has borne without complaint. But the line that catches you is simple and unadorned. I have done everything you taught me, and still I am lonely. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the shape of the sentence settle into your thoughts. You think it might be the truest thing in the room, that even a life performed exactly as instructed can feel like a hollow ritual, when the love meant to warm it was never offered. When you look back down, you notice there is no sign-off, no polite farewell. Just a blank space where her name ought to be, as if she has finally tired of signing herself in relation to a man who never learned to call her by anything but her duties. You reach for the last letter in the pile, the parchment heavier than the others, as though it has absorbed the weight of every word written upon it. The edges are darkened by time, and perhaps the brush of too many hands, each hoping to find something in its lines that might soften what came before. You unfold it carefully, feeling the way it resists, the creases stiff as an old grudge that has been folded and refolded until it can no longer lie flat. The handwriting is steady and large, the script of someone determined not to be misunderstood. It opens plainly, "Father," a single word that feels like both an address and a rebuke. What follows is not a list of complaints or a record of injuries, but something quieter and, in its way, more unsettling. The writer describes a life spent doing everything expected, tending the fields, marrying a good wife, raising children who knew better than to speak when spoken to. He recounts the small milestones that should have meant something, harvests gathered without loss, accounts balanced to the last farthing, the family name carried forward with no scandal to tarnish it. But the sentences never rise into any note of satisfaction. Instead, each one feels like a ledger entry, an account of deeds completed not with pride, but with a kind of numb determination. You imagine the writer sitting at a table much like this one, the candle flickering low, the ink drying too quickly in the draft, as he realizes that a life can look respectable and still feel hollow as an empty grain sack. He pauses mid-page to wonder whether his father ever felt anything like love for him, or whether the only affection he knew how to give was hidden instructions barked across a field, the rare nod of acknowledgement after a day of labour. He does not accuse, and he does not plead. He simply writes that he would like to understand how a man can spend decades in the same house with his children and never find a way to know them. Perhaps you think he will close with some last request, a hope that his father might finally speak the words he never offered. But the letter ends with a statement so quiet you almost miss it. "I have decided I will not measure my worth by your silence any longer." The ink trails off just before the final period, as though the pen itself had grown too tired to finish the thought. You set the parchment down, feeling the air in the room shift around you in the hush that always follows the reading of something truer than anyone expected it to be. You look over the letters spread before you, each one a small, undeniable testament to the idea that disappointment is never a single event, but a habit that grows until it becomes the only language a family shares. And as you sit there, the candle guttering lower, you understand that the saddest part is not the leaving, or the silence, or even the failure to be seen. The saddest part is how ordinary it all is, how many fathers and sons and daughters have written these same sentences, each convinced they were alone in thinking that love should be something more than duty performed in a cold room. You stand at the threshold of the cloister, the great wooden door swung open just enough to let you step inside. The air within is colder than you expected, a stillness so complete it feels as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. You thought it would smell of incense and polished wood, but it smells instead of damp stone, old rushes, and the faintest trace of beeswax from the candles that gutter along the refectory tables. This is where fathers of a different sort make their lives, men who have given up the ordinary duties of a household in favour of something quieter, something that demands a sacrifice you can't quite measure. You walk slowly past the rows of benches where monks sit hunched over their ledgers, their quills scratching across parchment with the soft, steady insistence of rain falling on a slate roof. No one looks up as you pass, and you feel, absurdly, as though you've trespassed into a place where even your heartbeat might be considered a disruption. Here, fatherhood is not measured in children born, but in souls guided, in prayers offered for strangers who will never know your name. You wonder if that is easier or harder than raising a child, who can look you in the eye and ask why you are near. At the far end of the hall, a monk with a lined face and a robe patched so many times it looks like a quilt lifts his head and regards you. His gaze is not unkind, but it is steady in a way that makes you feel as though he is weighing you against some invisible measure. You might expect judgment, some stern rebuke for interrupting this quiet discipline, but what you see in his expression is something closer to curiosity, an unspoken question about why you have come to this place where men have chosen to become fathers to silence rather than sons to legacy. He gestures for you to follow, his movements unhurried, each step a small declaration that nothing in this cloister will be rushed. You trail him through an archway into the scriptorium, where more monks work by lamplight, their faces bent so low over their work you can scarcely see where one man ends and the next begins. The air here smells of vellum and ink, and the faint, sour tang of wool dampened by hours of stillness. You think, perhaps, that there is something monastic about disappointment itself, how it requires you to sit with your failures until you almost begin to find comfort in their familiarity. The monk stops before a shelf stacked with neat piles of manuscripts, each labelled with a tiny tag of linen script. He reaches for one, his fingers careful as a man handling a living thing, and he passes it to you without a word. You take it, feeling the roughness of the binding, the slight give of the parchment under your thumb. You expect a book of psalms or sermons, but when you open it, you find a ledger, a record of donations and penances, of sins confessed and absolutions granted. You run your gaze down the long columns of names and dates, noting how many of them are the same year after year, the same men returning to unburden themselves of the same failings. You wonder whether these monks ever grow weary of hearing the same regrets spoken over and over, or if they find in repetition a kind of quiet purpose, the knowledge that even the most disappointing hearts still want to be known. You close the book gently, feeling the echo of all those whispered confessions settle into your hands like a weight you did not expect to carry. You set the ledger back on the shelf with the careful reverence of someone handling another person's memories. The monk who brought you here does not speak, but he nods as if to say that you've seen what there is to see. You follow him through another archway, your steps echoing in the cold air, until you emerge into a cloister garden so quiet you feel your own breath become part of the silence. It is a place built for contemplation, a small square of earth divided into neat beds where herbs grow in stubborn defiance of the season. You had expected colour and life, but winter has painted everything in shades of grey and brown, and the air smells of damp soil and the faint metallic tang of frost. He leads you to a low stone bench along the walkway and gestures for you to sit. When you lower yourself onto the cold surface, you notice how the wall beside you is worn smooth by years of hands trailing along it, monks who passed this way with their own quiet burdens. You wonder what kinds of thoughts have been carried through these cloisters, what small hopes and private disappointments have been sown among the lavender and rue. Perhaps you think monks live above such things, but you see now how little anyone escapes the ache of wanting to be enough. The old man folds his hands in his lap and looks across the garden, his eyes resting on nothing in particular. You study the way the wind lifts the corner of his hood, the way his breath leaves a faint cloud in the cold. It is strange to think of him as someone's son, someone who might have once bent his head under the same heavy expectations you have seen folded into so many letters. You try to picture him as a child, and for a moment you glimpse the shape of a boy who once believed that obedience was the surest path to love. He does not break the silence with any explanation of why he has brought you here. Instead, he simply lets the moment stretch between you, the air filling with the small sounds of winter, the slow drip of meltwater from the eaves, the dull scrape of a wooden rake across frozen earth somewhere out of sight. You feel the quiet settle in your chest, not heavy exactly, but insistent, the way a memory sometimes returns when you least expect it. After a while, he speaks in a voice so soft it feels more like a thought than a declaration. He says that there are many kinds of fathers in the world, some who give life, and some who give nothing but lessons. He says that not all lessons are kindly taught, but even harsh truths can shape something worth carrying forward. You don't know if he is talking about himself, about you, or about all the sons who have walked through these cloisters searching for a gentler inheritance. You nod, because it seems the only answer that fits. The wind moves through the garden again, stirring the brittle stems, and you think perhaps this is why so many men have chosen to stay here, because in a place devoted to silence, the quiet finally becomes something more than emptiness. It becomes a kind of understanding you don't have to earn. You rise from the bench when he inclines his head, and together you walk back along the cloister walk, your footfalls muffled by the rush matting that has been laid over the stone. You wonder how many feet have passed this way, how many men have paced out their days in the same measured steps, hoping that repetition might eventually wear away the sharper edges of regret. The monk leads you through another doorway, into a small chamber lined with shelves so crowded with parchment that the air tastes of old vellum and the faint, sweet dust of crumbling paper. He gestures to a table where a stack of records waits, each one bound in simple leather and marked only by the year. You expect chronicles of the monastery, accounts of tithes, inventories of bread and ale, ledgers of repairs, but when you lift the first volume and open it, you find something stranger. Each page holds the transcription of confessions, words spoken in the dark to men who wore no weapons and claimed no inheritance but the right to listen. The ink is faded to a brown so pale it looks like the memory of itself. You read a fragment of a confession that feels as if it could have been lifted from any of the letters you examined before. A young man admits that he has never been able to please his father, that every harvest feels like another chance to fail. Another line, from another hand, simply reads, "I am tired of pretending that respect and affection are the same thing." The words are small, but they feel as heavy as any crown. You close the volume gently, the leather creaking like an old door, and for a moment you think how strange it is that so many of these men came here seeking something softer than the world outside, only to discover that no walls, no rituals, no hours of silence can protect you from the disappointment you bring with you. The monk watches you, his face calm, though you think you see the smallest flicker of understanding in the way he tilts his head. He does not ask whether you recognize yourself in these confessions. He does not need to. In a place where so many have laid down the weight of what they could not be, it would be stranger if you did not feel something tighten in your chest as you read. You set the book back in its place and rest your fingertips lightly on the cover, as though you might leave some trace of gratitude for the honesty bound within it. Perhaps you expect the monk to begin explaining the purpose of these records, to offer some gentle philosophy about the importance of unburdening oneself. But instead he only folds his hands in front of him and says that here they have learned that naming a sorrow does not always end it. Sometimes it merely teaches you how to carry it without pretending it weighs nothing. You stand in the quiet together, the smell of parchment and old wax rising around you, and you realize that in this place, confession is not a transaction to be completed but a practice that never ends. And you think, not without a kind of reluctant respect, that there may be worse lessons a father can leave behind than the simple truth that even disappointment can be tended with care. You follow the monk back into the main passage, the cold pressing against your skin like a hand reminding you that here, comfort is something you must choose to live without. The hall is lined with small wooden doors, each one identical but for the iron latch that marks them as private. You wonder who sits behind them now, bent over a manuscript or a prayer or a memory that still refuses to grow inspired. Perhaps you expect that in a place devoted to devotion, the men would be content with their solitude. But as you walk, you can feel how the walls hold the echo of all the confessions ever spoken here, small, unremarkable sorrows that still refuse to fade. He stops before a door that stands slightly ajar, and with a tilt of his head, he invites you to look inside. You step over the threshold and find a chamber so spare it feels almost unfinished, a low bed of rough planks, a narrow table, a single stool worn smooth by years of the same body lowering itself into the same posture. On the table sits a candle stub burned nearly to the base, and a small carved cross no taller than your thumb. The air smells of cold ash and the faint tang of beeswax. You imagine that this is a place where men come to remember who they tried to be before they learned how much of themselves they would have to surrender. For a moment you stand there unmoving, as though any sudden gesture might wake some memory that lingers in the walls. You try to imagine what it would feel like to call this cell your home. Perhaps you think it would be easier to be a father here, to guide others without the weight of daily disappointments pressed between you and the people you love. But then you see the small ledger on the table, the cover worn soft where a thumb has rested so many times in hesitation, and you understand that no life is ever free from the wish to be seen kindly. The monk steps past you, his robe whispering across the floor, and lifts the ledger as if to show you something precious rather than merely practical. He opens it to a page near the center, and you see a list of names written in a hand that is neat but unornamented. At the top of the page is a single sentence that feels, in its way, like an answer to every letter you have read tonight, Here are the men who have come to unlearn what their fathers taught them. The words are so unadorned they feel almost gentle, as though whoever wrote them believed there was no shame in admitting how much of ourselves we inherit without meaning to. You glance over the names, none of which you recognize, and you feel a peculiar sorrow rise in your throat, not because their stories are unfamiliar, but because they are so precisely the same as all the others. A line beside each name notes the year the man arrived, the year he took his vows, and nothing more. No explanations, no justifications, only the quiet record of people who decided that silence was more bearable than trying any longer to be loved the way they had hoped. The monk closes the ledger and returns it to the table with a care that feels almost ceremonial. For a moment, you wonder if he sees you as another name waiting to be entered, another weary heart looking for a place to rest. But he says nothing, and you find you are grateful for it. Some kindness is quieter than speech. When you step back into the passage, you feel the hush wrap around your shoulders like a cloak you did not ask to wear. The monk does not hurry you, only waits with the same patient stillness you've begun to think of as the closest thing to affection in this place. You walk together toward the far end of the hall, where a door stands open to a narrow courtyard ringed with bare hedges and a single gnarled tree that looks as though it has been holding its breath for a century. The sky overhead is the soft grey of wool soaked in rain, and the air tastes faintly of ash drifting from some unseen hearth. You pause at the threshold, because something in you expects that once you cross into this courtyard, you will feel the shape of all the lives lived here more sharply. You imagine the monks filing out into this space at dawn, their robes tugged by the same cold wind that tugs at your sleeve now, their breaths mingling with the mist as they recite prayers in voices so low they scarcely sound human. You try to picture them as young men, faces still unlined, hearts still hopeful that a life of devotion might protect them from the smaller, more personal disappointments that waited beyond the cloister walls. But the longer you look, the more certain you are that no such protection was ever real. The monk stops beside you and studies the courtyard as if he, too, can see the ghosts gathering among the hedges. He does not speak, but you can feel the slow gravity of his thoughts, the way they seem to fill the air until you are breathing them in without meaning to. Perhaps you expect him to offer some reassurance that time heals, that solitude refines what grief distorts, but when he finally turns his gaze toward you, there is only a tired understanding that no life, no matter how cloistered, is safe from the wish to be remembered fondly. You step forward onto the worn stones, feeling the cold seep up through the soles of your boots. The tree in the centre stands crooked, branches tangled against the sky, and you think there is something honest in how it never tried to grow straight. In a place where every life is measured by vows and disciplines, the tree seems to say that imperfection is the truest confession of all. You stand there a moment longer, letting that thought settle into you the way the chill has settled into your bones. When you glance back, the monk is watching you with the same steady calm. He gestures toward a low bench set against the courtyard wall. You sit, because it seems the only thing to do, and he joins you without ceremony. The silence grows fuller, less like an absence, and more like a shared language. For the first time since you entered this place, you feel a kind of relief, the small comfort of knowing there are others who have also learned that devotion does not always cure longing, and that sometimes it only teaches you to name it more precisely. The wind shifts, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something sweeter you can't quite name. You close your eyes, letting the moment become what it is without trying to shape it into anything more hopeful. And you think that here, in this quiet courtyard under a sky that refuses to brighten, disappointment feels almost gentle, like an old bruise you have finally stopped pressing to see if it still hurts. You sit on the bench a little longer, the cold from the stones slowly creeping up your spine, until it becomes something you simply accept rather than resist. The monk beside you folds his hands together, his fingers knotted in the patient pose of a man who has grown used to waiting for answers that never arrive. You find yourself wondering whether he has ever written a letter like the ones you've read, whether there is some small box in this monastery where his own confessions are hidden away, inked in the same cramped hand you've seen on so many brittle scraps of parchment. The courtyard seems even quieter than the cloisters, the stillness so complete it feels like a second skin. You might have imagined that a place dedicated to prayer would be filled with a sense of certainty, but as you look at the weathered stones and the bare branches overhead, you see only the shape of a faith that knows itself to be unfinished. Perhaps you thought monks were immune to ordinary disappointments, but here, in the hush that pools around your feet, you sense how many of them came here, not out of conviction, but out of the simple wish to be less afraid. The monk does not speak, but after a time he stands and gestures for you to follow. You walk together back through the low archways, and into a small chapel tucked behind the refectory. The air inside is warmer, the faint scent of beeswax and rosemary clinging to the narrow pews. A single lamp burns near the altar, its flame wavering but steady, like someone whispering a promise they don't quite believe. You sit in the back row, because it feels like a place meant for guests who have not yet decided whether to stay. At the front, the monk lowers himself onto the floor, crossing his legs in a posture that looks more like surrender than prayer. He does not look at you. He simply bows his head, as if to say that whatever you carry, you are permitted to set it down here for a while. You think about all the fathers you have read of, the ones who could not be satisfied, the ones who could not be bothered, the ones who measured love in tally marks of obedience. You wonder if any of them ever found their way to a place like this, where disappointment can be named aloud without being banished or excused. You lean back against the cool wood of the pew and close your eyes. The quiet is different here, less like emptiness, and more like the soft exhalation of a place that has learned not to expect too much. You realize you are holding your breath and let it go, feeling a thin thread of tension slip out of your shoulders. You know it will return when you leave this chapel, but for now, you allow yourself the small grace of believing it will stay gone a little while. When you open your eyes again, the lamp's flame has steadied, casting a pale glow across the monk's bowed head. You look at him and think there is something reassuring in the way he remains unmoved, as if he understands that the work of forgiving and being forgiven. You sit there together in the soft light, and for the first time, you feel that perhaps disappointment does not need to be hurried away. Perhaps it only asks to be witnessed, patiently, until it begins to loosen its grip. You remain in the pew as the minutes slip past, each one measured by the small, uneven flicker of the lamp on the altar. There is something almost hypnotic about the way the light sways, throwing long shadows across the floor that seem to stretch and shrink with every sigh of the building. You think how easy it would be to believe that such shadows belong to the monks who have prayed here before you men who sat in this same hush, learning how to name their regrets without expecting them to vanish. The monk shifts slightly, the fabric of his robe whispering across the stone. You watch the careful movement of his hands as he settles them on his knees, and you notice how the skin is cracked and lined in a way that suggests decades spent handling things too delicate for roughness. Perhaps you expected to find some sign that the choice to live apart from the world had made him serene. But as you study the quiet curve of his shoulders, you see that what it has made him is simply willing to sit still beside his own failures without flinching. You close your eyes again and listen to the air moving through the chapel, a sound so soft you might mistake it for your own breathing. In that moment, you wonder how many sons and daughters have knelt here, each of them bringing the same small, exhausted hope that if they spoke their disappointment aloud, it might finally become lighter. You think of all the letters you have read, pages where children tried to translate their longing into something that sounded respectable, and you realize that this place, more than any archive or ledger, is where their voices might have found an answer. Not a solution, not a reversal of all that was lacking, but simply the permission to be honest. When you open your eyes, the monk has turned his head slightly, watching you in that steady, unhurried way that feels less like scrutiny and more like a quiet acknowledgement. He does not ask what brought you here, nor does he presume to offer comfort you have not requested. Instead, he inclines his head, as if to say that whatever you are carrying is neither unique nor unforgivable. You find yourself grateful for the absence of any question, because you are not sure you could have explained it without sounding foolish. You lean forward, resting your elbows on your knees, and look at the lamp again. Its flame is small, but it does not waver. You think perhaps this is all any of us are trying to learn, how to keep some small light burning when the draft of disappointment never fully stops searching for a way in. The monk shifts once more, folding his hands together as though to remind you that endurance is not a miracle. but a practice. You sit there until your legs begin to ache and your mind grows quiet in the way that comes only after you have admitted that there is no more argument left in you. When you finally stand, the monk does as well, though he does not reach for you or offer any benediction. He simply watches as you turn toward the door, and in his silence, you hear something more reassuring than any blessing, the recognition that even here, even in this place of renunciation, some disappointments will always remain, and that perhaps the only grace is learning how to meet them without shame. You leave the chapel quietly, stepping back into the long corridor where the air feels colder, as though it has been holding itself apart from the warmth of the lamp's small flame. The monk does not follow you immediately, and for a moment you feel something close to relief that he has stayed behind, letting you make your way out alone. Your boots scuff along the rush matting, and you listen to the familiar creak of the beams overhead, each one carrying the memory of all the footfalls that came before yours. You think about how many men have walked these halls in the hush after confession, carrying nothing but the knowledge that honesty does not always heal, but it does unburden. You pass a window set deep in the wall, and you pause, resting your hand on the cold sill. Beyond the glass, the sky is the colour of old wool, thick with clouds that refuse to part. The garden below looks smaller than it did from within, and you think how often perspective is a trick, how a place can feel so vast when you are in it, and so contained when you stand outside looking in. Perhaps you expect to feel something like regret for having entered these walls, but you don't. If anything, you feel a faint, surprising gratitude for the way this quiet has allowed you to see your own doubts without needing to disguise them. You move on, past another row of identical doors, each one closed against the world and against whatever memories the men behind them are trying to outlast. You wonder if some of them will spend decades here, never quite managing to forgive themselves for the disappointments they inherited and the ones they passed on. The thought is not comforting exactly, but it is familiar, and there is a small ease in recognizing that your own failures are not unique. At the end of the passage, you pause again, your hand resting against the cool wood of a door left half open. Inside, you glimpse a monk bent over a small table, his head bowed, as if he is listening to something no one else can hear. The room smells of ink and wool, and the faint sweetness of old wax. For a moment, you are struck by how ordinary it all looks, this life built out of repetition and silence, each day folded precisely over the one that came before it. You might have expected monastic life to look grand in its austerity, but instead it feels as humble as any cottage, the only difference being the names of the things to remember. You step back, careful not to disturb whatever reflection the monk is tending. When you turn away, you find that the older monk has come to stand behind you, his hands folded in the loose sleeves of his robe. He does not smile, but there is something in his face that feels close to recognition, as though he understands that you are carrying less now than when you first stepped inside. He inclines his head, once no blessing, no benediction, just an acknowledgement that you have been seen. You walk past him toward the door that will take you back to the outer world, and as you cross the threshold, you feel the draught of winter air curl around your ankles. It is not a welcome, exactly, but it is honest. And in this place, you have learned that honesty, however cold it feels at first, is sometimes the most merciful thing of all. You step out into the cloister walk, the wind moving along the covered arcade in slow, deliberate gusts that find every gap in your cloak. For a moment you stand there and let the cold seep in. It feels honest in a way you hadn't expected, no softer than disappointment itself, but no harsher either. You look back once, your gaze tracing the worn stones and narrow windows, and you think how these walls have held more confessions than any book could ever record. Perhaps you believed coming here would help you understand the monk's devotion, but what you have learned is simpler. They are just men who have found a place where the quiet does not ask for explanations. You walk the perimeter of the cloister slowly, your footsteps sounding too loud in the hush. Along one side, an herb garden sits under a thin crust of frost, the last remnants of green pressed flat by the season. You lean over the low wall and study the labels set into the soil: sage, lavender, rue, names you know but sense you can no longer summon in the frozen air. For a moment you wonder if tending these beds feels any different from tending the small, stubborn regrets that sprout in every life. You suspect it doesn't. The work is the same, patient, repetitive, never quite finished. As you straighten, you see a monk crossing the far end of the cloister, his robe lifting slightly in the wind. He moves with the measured caution of someone who has learned to carry his own solitude without apology. You think perhaps that is what drew you here, some quiet envy of men who no longer pretend they can outrun what they carry. When he vanishes around the corner, the space he leaves behind feels larger, not emptier, as though his absence has made room for the possibility of your own unspoken truths. You continue walking until you reach a low arch that frames the entrance to a small library. The door stands open, and you hesitate at the threshold. Inside, shelves lean under the weight of vellum and parchment, their spines turned outward in silent rows. You step inside, drawn by the smell of old ink, wax, the faint sweetness of binding glue. It is the scent of effort that has outlasted its authors, a reminder that no act of recording is ever as final as we imagine. You run your fingertips along a row of bindings, feeling the ridges where titles have been pressed into leather. Some books bear only a single word: psalter, homilies, chronicles, while others are anonymous, their spines blank as if to confess that what they hold is too ordinary to boast about. You think of the letters you read, of all the names that were never inscribed anywhere, but in a line of ink that faded before anyone cared to preserve it. You wonder how many stories have been kept here simply because no one thought to throw them away. When you turn to leave, your eye catches on a shelf near the door where a single volume lies open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. You cannot read the text from here, but you do not need to. You already know it contains the same confession written in 100 different hands. The wish that one day someone would look past the mistakes, past the disappointments, and say that what remained was still worth something. You step back into the cloister one last time, the air pressing close against your skin as though to remind you that whatever comfort you found here with that, the wind slips around the arches, stirring the hem of your cloak, and you pause in the center of the walk to look up at the sky. It has darkened while you were inside, the clouds lowering themselves over the monastery like a lid over a pot that has been left to simmer too long. You might have expected the world beyond these walls to feel larger, but standing here, you realize that the smallness of this place is what makes it feel honest. Nothing here pretends to be more than it is. You take a slow breath, the cold tightening your throat, and you turn to face the corridor where the monk waits. He stands with his hands folded into his sleeves, his face unreadable in the dimming light. For a moment, neither of you moves. You think perhaps he is deciding whether to say anything, whether to offer the words you have not asked for, but when he inclines his head, it is not a gesture of farewell, nor of blessing. It is simply a recognition, as though he sees you clearly enough to know that no speech could make this departure any easier. You walk past him, your boots brushing over the rushes in a soft rhythm that seems to echo louder than it should. Along the walls, niches hold small wooden crosses, each one carved by a different hand, none of them perfectly aligned. You think there is something comforting in how no one here felt the need to straighten them, as though imperfection itself were a kind of devotion. Perhaps you expected monastic life to be a performance of piety, a place where every corner was scrubbed clean of doubt, but you see now that it is simply a place where men have agreed to keep each other's secrets without judgment. At the far end of the walk, you pause beside a low bench where a candle flickers inside a niche, its flame bending and recovering with each small draught. You rest your hand on the cold stone and close your eyes for a moment, letting the hush settle around you like a cloak. You think about all the fathers you have read of kings and peasants, monks and merchants, each one carrying the same uncertainty in different shapes, the fear that their worth could be measured only in what they failed to give, and the hope, however faint, that someone might still look at them and see more than their shortcomings. When you open your eyes, the monk has stepped closer, though he does not touch you or speak. He only stands at your shoulder, a silent witness to this small moment of leaving. You realize then that this is the most anyone can promise in such a place, to see you without expectation, to let you go without asking you to return. You take one last look at the cloister, the uneven crosses, the pale sky, the worn stones that have carried so many feet, and you feel a kind of tired gratitude for the way this place has made space for every disappointment you brought inside. As you turn away, you think perhaps that is the quietest, most durable form of forgiveness, a place that does not require you to pretend you were never disappointed at all. You step beyond the threshold at last, the door closing behind you with a quiet finality that feels softer than you thought it would. The evening air meets you with a chill, a small reminder that whatever peace you borrowed inside those walls will not insulate you from the ordinary cold waiting outside. You take a moment to stand there, breathing in the dampness that rises off the stones, and you let your eyes linger on the silhouette of the cloister behind you, just a simple shape against the darkening sky. No grand sign of redemption or absolution, only the honest fact of what it has been. A place where you allowed yourself to sit with your disappointments until they grew less sharp. You start down the path that leads away from the monastery, your boots finding the ruts worn into the earth by all the others who have come here to unburden themselves. Each step feels deliberate, as though you are relearning how to walk without the weight of expectations pressing so close to your skin. The night air settles around your shoulders, and though it is cold, it no longer feels unkind. It feels, in its way, like an invitation to carry forward what you have gathered here, not as a burden, but as something more like a witness. You pause once more, glancing back over your shoulder for the last time. In the darkness, the low rooflines and narrow windows look almost like any other house, a place where men eat and sleep and grow old together. You think that is the truest thing about it. There is no magic in these stones, no secret that transforms disappointment into joy. There is only the quiet company of others who have also failed to be everything they were supposed to be. And somehow, that is enough. You stand there in the hush, the night breathing gently around you, and you feel the small, steady comfort of knowing you are not alone in your uncertainty. The sky above is a wash of grey, the stars hidden behind the slow drift of cloud, and you think perhaps it is better that way. Too much light can be as unforgiving as too much darkness. Sometimes you realize the soft in-between is the safest place to rest. Thank you for staying with me until the end of tonight's story. I hope, wherever you are, that you feel the same small easing of breath that comes when you know no one expects you to be more than you already are. If you'd like, you're welcome to join me again next time, when we'll wander into another quiet corner of the past, and maybe find another piece of ourselves waiting there. And now, as you lie there, you know the loop will wait once more for you.